Jamie, and I apologize for any speaking that Bruce and I did beforehand. The truth is, Bruce is so easy to talk to, and the conversation is so wonderful that it was just difficult for me to not just initially start a conversation. Not to mention that we're two lawyers, so we're used to hearing our voice. So sometimes it's tough just to sit here and say nothing. So, but anyway, let me start by saying I'm honored to be here, and certainly honored to be talking to Bruce Adelson today. As you know, Bruce wrote a book about 20 years ago, and called "Brushing Back Jim Crow," and I read it. I found it a fascinating book, and I want to welcome you all to Bruce. And Bruce, welcome. And when you get a chance, I'd love to hear a little bit about your book.
Well, thank you, Michael and Jamie, and I very much appreciate the invitation to come and talk today. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope everybody is safe and well. This book began in Savannah, Georgia, in Grayson Stadium, which is the longtime stadium of professional baseball in Savannah. I had finished a book tour from my first book, which was a travel guide to minor league baseball in the US and Canada, and I happened to be in Savannah. So I'm watching this game, and I realized, and I was thinking about something I had researched from my first book, that Hank Aaron as a teenager played in Savannah in 1953. Well, Savannah in 1953 is much different than Savannah today. There was Jim Crow segregation, rampant discrimination, racism. Savannah was not, like most of the South, was not a free and open society. But it really struck me, and I started to wonder, well, what impact must it have had on both Black people and white people in 1953 to see a Black man playing professional baseball in Savannah for the first time. Now, Savannah being segregated by race, separate restrooms, separate everything. So to actually see a Black man sitting on the bench with white players playing baseball where could be the only Black player on the field, I just kept wondering, well, what impact did that have? And did it have any kind of larger part in the civil rights movement and the effort to move forward with desegregation, integration, the end of Jim Crow? So that inspired me. And then eventually I thought of the concept for the book. I did some early research. I spoke to several publishers who really saw the prospects of linking these two things, baseball, professional sports, and civil rights, in a way that hadn't been done before, which was very appealing to me. So after working out, finding a publisher that I liked, and working out all the things that we needed to as lawyers, then I proceeded to research and write the book. Spent a lot of time, weeks, months, mostly in the Deep South, small towns, interviewing people, going to libraries, looking at old newspaper clips. It was a really fascinating process, something that I remember quite vividly, and something that led to the conclusion that I had believed, and my publisher had believed, that yes, integrating baseball in the Jim Crow South at the minor league level did have a significant role in opening up society. And as John Lewis told me in one of my favorite interviews in the book, that it had a role in what came later, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, subsequent school integration, lunch counter integration, the Montgomery bus boycott, that it had its own place in that panoply of events that moved society forward.
Yeah, it's a great story. And one of the things I noticed about the book is that it was largely in narrative form. I know I mentioned this earlier. My mom actually wrote a book back, I believe, in the late 80s, early 90s, about Black history in Howard County, which is a suburb of Baltimore and Washington. And her book was also largely narrative. And she, as she would come back and play me tape after tape after tape after tape after tape, she was just so excited about actually talking to the people and hearing history from that vantage point. Did you find a similar experience, even with all your research? Did you find anything extra just in actually talking to those who went through it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the highlight of writing and researching was actually sitting down with these men and talking to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I became very close to many of them, both the players and their families, as we talked about what they experienced. But I think that to kind of further your point, Michael, that to me, history is what the history makers say and do. That I can provide as an author context, a narrative,
Mm-hmm.
but it's their story. And this is something that I talked to the publisher about and said, I think that this book will make an impact in many ways, but one of them is, let's focus on what they say. Let's focus on their relating their own stories rather than my spinning it. We'll just put in the book their words. So the publisher loved it. The players really liked it. It also gave me the selfish benefit of talking to them longer than in a typical interview.
Sure.
Because I needed a lot of material to do what I wanted in the book. And we also, because we had long conversations, they became quite, perhaps even more open than they would ordinarily. And
Right.
Sometimes they got quite emotional about what they did, what they experienced. And invariably they would say, nobody asked me this. I've never really talked to anybody about it. Some of the players' wives were there when I interviewed them, and they would say, you never told me that. I mean, I was with you in Shreveport in '55. I don't remember that. So that was all part of I think the greater experience. And as an author, it really made the whole project even more exciting for me.
Right. Right. Yeah, I apologize if there's any background noise, a lawn mowing. My son is actually out front mowing the lawn. I've asked him for the last week, so finally, of course, he does it at this time.
Of course.
So, he has a gift for this. But anyway, in reading the book, it took me a little while to really get into the context of what was really going on here, because I'm sitting comfortably in my living room, whatever, and we're 70 years after the fact, and it's tough to get a true understanding of how important baseball was at that time and in that environment. And as I tried to think back in years, I thought, well, first of all, TV was just in its infancy, and so there was very little sports on TV. There were no there were no Southern Major League teams at that time. I believe the most Southern teams might have been Washington, D.C., and then over in Cincinnati, where I'm from. So I am a big Red Machine fan, by the way. So, and even that doesn't get to how important baseball was to the actual culture of the communities in a society. Could you expand on it a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that it's easy today to look at the NFL, the NBA, because they are very prominent, preeminent sporting organizations. And the sports that people play, young people and people a little older, may not necessarily be baseball. What people don't realize, in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, there were hundreds of professional minor league baseball teams throughout the country. Some really small towns in the South and Midwest had teams. So and like you said, Michael, you didn't watch Monday Night Football. There was no Monday Night Football. Right. The NFL and the NBA were nothing like they are today. So the game in town, for the most part, throughout the United States, was professional baseball. And that's something that John Lewis told me. He said that why, of course, he was familiar with Jackie Robinson, and he followed the Brooklyn Dodgers, and then, of course, the Los Angeles Dodgers. He said, but I also knew what about the teams in Montgomery, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama, and Jackson, Mississippi, because they're all relatively close. They particularly had resonance for him when Black players began to play in many of these places. He said, that got my attention, got the attention of a lot of other people too. So you're right. I mean, with context, sports in the 50s was nothing like it is today. TV was just beginning. There were no national broadcasts of basketball. There was no Monday night, Sunday night football, Super Bowl, nothing. You wanted to watch sports in your community, you go down to the ballpark and see your local minor league team. That was likely going to be your sporting escapade or enjoyment, at least in person, for many, many years.
Yeah, and I would even broaden it outside of sports to entertainment, because also, and this is probably more relevant in the South, air conditioning was just beginning. Many homes didn't have air conditioning. So when it's, 85 degrees on a summer evening, you don't want to be inside. Your options are, I guess, to go to a movie, and you may be inside also, or go out and watch a baseball game. So really, I think it was even more than just sports. It was the fact that there was nothing else for entertainment. I mean, what else are people going to do?
Yeah, I agree. I think, Michael, that's really important. That goes to the larger point about why integrating this part of society had such a tremendous impact, because metaphorically speaking, it was the only game in town. It was the primary form of entertainment. It was something, no matter how small the town, with its small newspaper, there were headlines about what that team was doing. Maybe 300 people showed up on a Saturday night to watch the game, but everybody knew what was going on. Yeah, I agree with you. That's a great point.
Yeah, it's true. And even another thing I thought about were that there were no major league teams in the South, and people's real only access to them might have been through the radio, or sometimes baseball teams would basically barnstorm through the South, or of course there's spring training. But in those days, since most baseball players basically earned blue collar wages, they needed to work more, even longer than a season. And one way to do that was actually through traveling through the South in areas that didn't see Major League Baseball and having exhibition games.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I know I wrote a little bit about some spring training exhibition games in the South between major league teams, particularly after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. There was an economic imperative in many communities to bring the Dodgers in, because they knew they'd fill the ballpark in ways they hadn't before. But it was interesting is what many of the players I interviewed said to me. Jackie Robinson would come in, they'd play a game or two, and then he'd leave.
Right.
So the impact of Robinson in, let's say, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, was minimal because of the lack of television overall. He really didn't have any kind of significant physical presence. So maybe the Dodgers would come into whatever the city or town was, play a game or two, and then they go up north. Well, as some of the players told me, that essentially Ed Charles, who played for the Mets and played on the 1969 World Champion Mets, told me that he and other players viewed themselves as Jackie Robinson's disciples, that they were taking his message a step further. And as Ed conceded, perhaps into more dangerous waters, perhaps into more problematic territories, but these were also places that there might have been an awareness of Jackie Robinson, but he told me Jackie wasn't here.
Yeah.
He was gone.
Right.
So it was up to us.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that you touched on that I want to dive into a little bit further, which I didn't think about at the time, but actually the reason for this integration in the South it wasn't because of social reason. I mean, it was really motivated by something else to the owners, and that being financial. So
Yes,
yeah,
yes. And there were a few, for their times, progressive owners of some of these teams who genuinely believed that the integration of baseball was important. But in my research and my experience, the majority looked at it from a dollars and cents perspective.
sure,
And they realized that bringing in Black players, African American players would increase the attendance, primarily among Black fans. And they invariably turned out to be correct.
Mhm.
That fans who would not tolerate sitting in segregated ballparks, watching white players in Jim Crow settings, that really didn't have a lot of allure for many people. So the owners capitalized on that. Now, unfortunately, sometimes they signed players who flamed out pretty quickly. They didn't have the ability to perform at least even at an average level. So there were some players came in through an inning and then their careers ended. Some players terribly, as Henry Aaron told me, for example, did not have the wherewithal to withstand segregation and Jim Crow. That some who were very talented athletically
mm-hmm.
had careers end prematurely, in the players' own opinions, because of the terrors, the experiences, and the constant insult isn't even a strong enough word, but every day, every night. And again, these men were mostly teenagers.
Yeah.
So yes, there were some whose careers did not fulfill the ambition that they had and the promise that many felt that their skills gave them, in large part because of the reality of Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that, of course, we know about Jackie Robinson, we know about Larry Doby, we know about Willie Mays, some of the very early pioneers. When Major League started this experiment, they actually had a decent pool to go through from the Negro Leagues. And then after years, after you're picking those who are most eligible to make that change, now you're not dealing with the same level of either one, preparedness or experience to make a quick jump to the major leagues.
Well, I think that's a great point. I think there was a real, as you said, there was a real financial push, particularly in the early 50s, to essentially find Black players. Mm-hmm. We need Black players. We want to capitalize on having Black players, increase the fans who come in, increase our revenue. So the Negro Leagues proved to be a fertile ground for teams looking for players to integrate professional non-Negro League baseball. But there did come a point, like you said, that the well started to run a little bit dry from the team's perspectives, even though the players, of course, thought of it differently. I had a lot of players who would tell me, Bruce, I played with somebody in the Negro Leagues in 1962, and I know he could have, gone to the big leagues. The Negro Leagues in the early 60s are much different than they were in the 40s and the early 50s. But you're right, that many of the earliest players well into the 50s were Negro League alumni. Mm-hmm. Then as more Latino players were brought into the big leagues, more Latino players were signed to play in the minor leagues.
Right.
So that started more in the mid 50s and then continued. So the Negro Leagues and the minor leagues had a very interesting juxtaposition and dynamic. But there are a lot of players that I interviewed in person, over the phone, in many ways. You said, boy, that guy Bruce I played with in Birmingham, he was the best shortstop I ever saw, and he never got his chance. I heard about a lot of people like that.
Yeah. And I think there were reasons for some of that. Of course, the owners might look for the temperament of the player. The age of the player was important. There are other factors in there. One thing was that I read that was interesting, that you do start to discuss some of the players who were from Dominican Republic or other areas, not from the South, who, of course, the one to play in major leagues in the South, and really had a severe wake-up call to experience like they'd never had before.
Oh, exactly. When you add Jim Crow,
Yeah,
race, and then add on to that language and culture, that was a significant barrier for many. Frankly, it still is. When I was a sports reporter, about 15 years ago, I spoke to minor league and baseball executives who would tell me about young men from Panama, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, playing in some small town in upstate New York or Western Massachusetts where no one speaks Spanish.
yeah,
And players themselves telling me that the only words that they knew how to speak were cheeseburger and pizza.
yeah,
Because they learned very quickly that, well, then I can eat.
right.
Those are words. There may be other words, but cheeseburger and pizza are very important.
Sure.
But the players who came from Latin America, yes, they had to encounter much, and the whole Jim Crow reality, racism, and segregation were significant surprises to them. Many of the men that I met were originally from the South, and told me that we understood segregation, we understood Jim Crow, but the players from other countries, players from other parts of the United States, for many of them, it was an incredibly difficult adjustment at first. And as I said, many of them it was just too difficult for them to adjust.
Yeah, that's understood. I mean, I remember 12 years ago, my wife and I took a trip to Paris, and I took French 1 and 2, but long forgotten most of it. And I can still remember being near the airport at a gas station trying to wash the car, and just having the most difficult time because no one there spoke English, and I didn't speak French. So something as simple as going to a place to get a car wash. I mean, to get your car wash, we did it ourselves, but it became fairly traumatic until someone who was just in line said, "I speak English," and wow, it's like, what a difference. So, that on top of everything else is amazing.
I agree. You just reminded me of something, and this is not, this is a story that just happened in the last year or two. But I wrote about a man, his name was Chico Heron. I believe he was from Panama. He was the first Black player to play professional baseball or really professional athletics in Mississippi. I think I wrote about a paragraph about him. I couldn't find a lot of material. I was unable to locate him to interview. I got an email might have been about a year and a half ago from his son, who asked me if I'm the one who wrote this book, that he said that he had just discovered the mention of his father in my book. And his father didn't talk a lot about what he did. So he asked me if we could meet, and we met. I live in the Maryland suburbs of DC. He and an associate came up, we met, and they did a film where they talked about what Chico Heron did. They actually found the stadium where he played in Mississippi. Wow. It's overgrown with weeds and trees, but it's still there. People in the community remember him. He didn't play that long, but it's a remarkable story, and it was so immensely gratifying to me to meet his son. His son got very emotional about what his dad did, and then to say that you wrote about my dad. It's in this book, and he would showed everybody. So actually, one of the an additional satisfaction for me, I was born in the Bronx, so I am genetically required to be a Yankees fan. He showed my book to Mariano Rivera on the eve of Rivera's induction to the Hall of Fame, because Heron had been his coach coming up. So, and Rivera said to Chico Heron's son, I never knew that your dad did this. Your dad is a hero. Your dad's like Jackie Robinson. That like made my year. It also, as we were talking before, parents of teenage sons, that when I told my son that, he doesn't really get really excited about the ins and outs of being an attorney. But when I told him this story, he said, whoa, Dad, that's actually a really cool thing. So yes, that was one of the highlights of last year.
That's awesome. It is great to actually get back so much from the effort you put into it, just from your human interaction. And, not only then, but, now 20 years after the fact, you're still getting that. And I think that's wonderful.
Thank you. I do too.
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked about your book was that, yes, I knew that there must have been integration of minor league baseball in the South. But you kind of take it as a context of, okay, during this 10 years, this happened. But I love that in your book, you go year by year, 50, 51, 52, 53, and showing the incremental steps and all the challenges that the players went through amongst all the leagues. Because, of course, as you said, there are hundreds of leagues on there. It's nothing like the minor league system of today. Basically, any town and community has a minor league team. It's just, it's part of the culture. But what I love was actually going through it year by year with you. And then, so you hear about the small victories, then you get the Brown v. Board of Education decision and talk about how that affected things afterwards and how there was a lot of pushback. And then how eventually, through mostly federal court decisions, and I believe you mentioned ICC once, that the inevitable happened. It just took a long time and had to get through a lot of forces to get there.
Yeah, and that was something that I thought was really important, to put all of this in context.
Mm-hmm.
And that to John Lewis's point, and looking at all of this as a continuum.
Right.
That we know about Brown, we know about the Montgomery bus boycott, but where does baseball fit in here? And he told me, he said, it fits in big. It was writ large at the time, and it had a significant impact. And one of the interesting things, I think, with these men, they, of course, didn't look at themselves as champions of integration, champions of civil rights. I mean, they all were quite, in fact, all of them were just quite blatant to say, look, Bruce, it's hard enough to hit a curveball. Yeah. I'm 19. I've never been away from home. I'm just learning to play. And I want to get to the big leagues. That's my career ambition. But we talked earlier about having longer interviews and learning about each other more, and then also hearing more about them on a different level of depth. When they would say, yeah, of course we knew what was happening, even if for no other reason, because we couldn't stay with the team in the team hotel. Right. We couldn't eat with the team in the team restaurant. Yeah. We saw each stadium had segregated seating, segregated restrooms, segregated water fountains. Of course we knew. So did we know, as Ed Charles said, that what we were doing was going to make an impact? Interestingly, in some places, like in New Orleans, in Norfolk, Virginia, they integrated. Norfolk integrated, the ballpark integrated because of pressure from the fans. Yeah, African Americans in the community. Right. So there were these, as you said, these little victories. Some teams went out of business, like the team in New Orleans, the biggest minor league in the South, the Southern Association, went out of business because it would not acclimate to the times and integrate and accept African American players. So there were all of these events playing out off the national stage, not on TV. There's no internet, of course, and no social media It's just word of mouth and local newspapers. But it was also interesting to see how the African American press covered many of these events, because I think by and large, those journalists were aware of how this fit in, as John Lewis described, and the importance of, like, Chico Heron playing in Mississippi. They understood the importance of that. It may not have gotten play in the New York Times, but it got play in a lot of other places, and the people in these areas knew exactly what was happening.
Yeah. Yeah, you referenced the, got a lot of material from the Pittsburgh Courier, I recall. And I always remember Pittsburgh Courier, of course, being from Pittsburgh, but halfway through the book, I'm saying, wait a minute, was there a Pittsburgh somewhere in the South? Because there's so much information coming from Pittsburgh. So I actually had to look just to make sure. Yes, it is a Pittsburgh, but it was an African American paper. So, of course, so it wrote more on these stories. But it was impressive still that a lot of information was at least getting through and eventually getting out. So that's
absolutely. And the as it was called, the black press at the time, they were very alert to these men and these stories. And they, as I said, they really were very cognizant of what this meant for the larger picture.
Yeah. And you mentioned these players, and at this age now, I want to call them kids, especially now I have a son who's that age. But you're right, and have, like I said, it's tough enough learning how to hit a curveball. But now they also have to worry about where they're going to stay, where they're going to eat, if they're going to be able to eat. So they're also going through this process, not having the same access to training and nutrition that the other players were. So
and I think that's a good point. It's really important to emphasize that they had these additional, as you say, these additional uncertainties. Thinking through, well, I stayed in this house last night, and now I just learned I have to stay someplace else. So yes, there was that. And there was also the story that Chuck Harmon told me. Chuck Harmon was the first African American to play for the Cincinnati Reds. About a cab ride in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that became a real event because of the seemingly dramatic prospect of seeing a black man and a white man in a white cab. And he described how this got a lot of attention from the police and people in the community, but also it goes to the point of what you said, that the players also have to think about, well, how am I getting to the ballpark? If I'm staying with a family, I'm not in the hotel, that means I have to go to the ballpark myself. How do I do that? Walking, taking a black cab, mass transit at the time, certainly in the early 50s, wasn't an option. So you're right, that there were a lot of other factors that came into play. I think that's also part of the reason that some of the ball players who were regarded as quite talented athletically were not able to progress as far as they wanted to. And some of them, I talked to some of them, they were very honest in saying that the pressure was unremitting, unyielding. It was something that I just never got used to it. So they, although they certainly regretted what had happened, they're also very honest about, I was not able to overcome what others did.
And you give a lot of stories that really touch on this. A couple that I recall. One was discussing about difficulties of the player, especially regarding language. I believe, I don't know if it was Felipe Alou, but it was one player who was basically, he's dropped off the bus into a town where he knew and didn't know anyone. Someone shows up and says, "Hey, you this person? Okay, I'm going to take you to this house." So I know some people. Oh, he mentioned it was a beautiful young lady who stopped and actually took him to a first house because she knew a couple ball players were there. He eventually had to go to a different house, and I think he actually missed his first games the next day just because he didn't know that there was a game, or the people at the house didn't know there was a game. So it's all these little things that you hear about. It's like you don't even really consider that. Oh yeah, I mean, it would kind of matter for the player to know when and where the game was.
Well, you and I would think that.
Yes.
But apparently people at the time did not. And I think that was Philippe Alou, who was sent from a minor league team in Louisiana
Mm-hmm.
to Florida. I think that was after Louisiana had banned interracial athletics and criminalized them.
Right.
So he got on a bus, went to Florida, never did any, he was never did anything like that before.
Right.
Got off the bus at his new team's town in Florida. Nobody met him. So language was an issue. He didn't speak English. No one was around who spoke Spanish.
Yeah.
No one met him. So that's another thing too. What he was at the time, 18, 19 years old. So like, excuse me, so what the hell am I supposed to do now? And
Exactly.
you're right. Did he miss the game that night? He didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's not baseball was for these guys was a lot more than just learning how to use a wood bat and standing in against a fastball.
Yeah. Yeah. And he might have been the person who actually, when he arrived to Florida, arrived hungry, because I believe the team gave him $12 to spend on food, but every time the bus would stop, and it would stop in a small location, small community, whatever, and he'd have to go find, first of all, the where he could eat and get in that line, and he found out that the bus was always moving,
Right.
Going to leave fast enough that he actually couldn't sit down or even have a meal. So he ended up basically for 2.5 days eating peanuts from a machine, because that's
Right.
where he can go and quickly get something and get back on the bus.
Exactly. That's a great example. And that was something, that was one of those stories when I interviewed him. He said, oh, yeah. And then there was this and this and this and this.
Mm-hmm.
So I had the privilege of, this was in spring training when he was the manager of the Expos, talking to him for a fair amount of time.
Right.
And even when someone would come into his office and say, Skip, we got practice starting. Yeah, I'll be there. I got to talk to this guy first. I'll be there. But I think by the time the fifth or sixth person came in, he realized, okay, maybe I need to get going.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderful. It's great that you were able to talk to so many people. I mean, some of the names I know, like you mentioned Cito Gaston in there. You mentioned, of course, Hank Aaron, I know well enough about, and Billy Williams, but you also got to show us the experience of Percy Miller, of an Ed Charles, of a Joe Durham. And that I thought was just really incredible. The people who, while they might not have gotten to where they wanted to, or for a short period of time, just to see also what they had to go through. I mean, Hank Aaron,
I appreciate that. Michael, I appreciate that. That was really important to me to find the hidden gems, so to speak. Like Percy Miller, was right out of high school in Danville, Virginia. He became the first African-American to play integrated baseball in that part of the country. This was in 1951.
Right.
He only played for a month and a half. He went into the service, was injured. He never played professional baseball again. But he told me that even though he was a very modest man, but he said, I don't want to think of myself as Jackie Robinson, because obviously Jackie Robinson did what I couldn't do.
Right.
But I kind of did the same thing in Danville, in North Carolina. Danville being, of course, the last capital of the Confederacy, which he was certainly aware of. He grew up in Danville. So he understood what was happening. I spoke to his old high school coach, I think, and he told me about how the difficulties he had even playing in his hometown in areas that he was familiar with as a youngster right out of high school, how hard it was for him. But that people saw what he did, which nobody else had ever done there before, and it did make an impact. So that the other African-American players who came later, like Bill White, for example, I'm not suggesting that they had a different level of experience, but Percy Miller paved the way for all of them in that part of the country. He was an 18-year-old right out of high school. Yeah. And he told me he didn't really appreciate what he was getting into until he was in it.
Yeah. And he actually gave up a lot. I believe he actually had a scholarship to, what was it, West Virginia State or something.
Yeah, that's right. He had a football scholarship.
And it's basically his dad pushed him into playing. I mean, because this is, I mean, it was wonderful how they chose him. I mean, he was a 3-sport star, state championships, and he was a name in the area. But it really took his dad, and really an emotional plea from his dad to make him take this course.
You're right. It was one of those heavy father-son moments. Percy wanted to go play football in West Virginia.
Yeah.
He didn't want to play ball. And you're right. His father was very emotional.
Yeah.
Discussing the importance of this and what it would mean. And Percy said, I just did what my dad asked me to do. And you're right. He gave up a big football scholarship.
Yeah. Yeah, those father-son discussions can be tough. I actually remember with my dad, who joined the Air Force in 1950s, and was in the Korean War, actually stationed in Japan. But of course, he told me a story about once he drove from Fort Bragg or wherever, or it might have been Hood, I can't remember, but drove to Cincinnati because he was homesick and just all that he went through, and being down there during Jim Crow. And actually, while I was young, when I was younger growing up, I only knew, okay, he fought during this wars in Japan. I knew that, but it wasn't until I was an adult, and maybe he waited a while to share it, or maybe just some things you just kind of keep inside. But he actually didn't open up about a lot of those things that happened to him until I was, well into my 20s, and probably able to understand a little bit better.
Yeah, I have a similar experience, and I have a different father-son take with my father.
Right.
My father did not want me to pursue a writing career. My mom was a novelist. My dad was, very into the whole, you're a lawyer, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I kept telling him, I'm not giving up being a lawyer. I passed the bar. I'll always be a lawyer. But Bruce, you're a lawyer and you're doing this. And I've done a lot of litigation, a lot of big cases. And I said, but Dad, I want to do this. If I don't do it, I'll regret it. One of the ultimate ironies is I worked for the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division. Yeah. And when I interviewed with Justice, I had been away from active practicing law for a couple of years. So I was concerned about, is that going to factor against me? When I went in for my interview, every person I talked to had a copy of my book, and all they wanted to talk about was my book. So after I left, and I don't think I had a cell phone then, I used the payphone and told my wife that, I think this is probably going to work out, because if they're asking me about my book, and they seem to like doing that, then I think it's looking good. When Justice made me the offer and I accepted it, and I told my dad, he got very emotional about my taking this job. But then I also, after he calmed down, stopped crying a little bit, I said, Dad, remember you told me you didn't think I should be an author? The main reason I got this job was because of this book. And he looked at me, and he clearly had an epiphany. And he said, whoa, Bruce, you know what? You were right. Maybe I should listen to what you say more often. I told him that story for years.
That's a huge admission for any parent.
Yeah, there you go. That's right. But Michael, I never let him forget it either.
Oh, very good. I'm trying to look to see if I have any questions, because I'm happy to talk to you all day. I'm not seeing anything, but if I'm missing something, I apologize. I do want to couple of things I want to ask. One is more general, and I know you touched on. I think you touched on this a little bit. But what did you, now 20 years after the fact, what are you now able to take from the writing of this book and the whole experience of it? Because it's more than just the writing. It's the writing almost is like a small part. It's like the whole research project takes so long, and just and the relationships and everything else that takes so long, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, I should write a book. So what did you, as you look back, what was there anything central that you feel that you took were able to take from the writing of the book and from the experience?
Well, I'm a big believer that our common American story, in a way, has a lot of information and inspiration that many people just don't appreciate or don't realize. You know, as an author and as a historian, that's something that is always of significant interest to me.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the motivation in writing this book, and I think that it's carried forward for me in my career and in the work that I do now, and also in the teaching that I do now, is that I know I keep coming back to this, but I like this analogy so much. John Lewis's continuum. That
Yeah.
Bruce, there's a continuum of history and a continuum of events. And you can look at the civil rights era and events from other eras, but they all fit together, perhaps not in a way that we realize at the time, and we only realize in retrospect, but they all fit together. They all have contributions to make to a larger issue. I teach bias and discrimination at the Georgetown Medical School. And one of the things that I talk to my students about is these similar issues about understanding bias, but also understanding where we were and where we are, talking about people who may be different than we are, look differently, speak differently, and understanding that we react to them and they react to situations, as do we, differently. So I think that although, and I've talked to my students actually about this book, and we've looked at some of the anecdotes and experiences in the book. I think for me as an educator, it's important for them to understand, as we talked about at the beginning, how different it was in many ways then, because one of their first reactions is, why didn't they use their cell phone? Or, you know, why are they doing that? I mean, that kind of surreal look at the way things were 70 some odd years ago, I think it's important for them and for others to understand where its place in history, how we can learn from that, and how what we're seeing today and the Black Lives Matter movement, the protests, the renewed emphasis and attention to issues of bias, racism, discrimination, systemic racism, that looking at that John Lewis continuum and seeing how they affect each other.
Right.
There is a dynamic relationship, but also how we can learn from and perceive what happened, like to Percy Miller in 1951 in Danville, and see how he dealt with that, how he reacted. But as we were talking about earlier, I think we talked about this last week too, that fans, just flat out racist KKK people who have no interest, desire, belief in seeing any kind of integration, would come up to some of these men, extend their hand, which frankly in 1953 in Birmingham, Alabama, or Shreveport, or Jackson, Mississippi, Pensacola, Florida, that was a big thing, and could suggest there might be something unpleasant that's coming. But they would say, I didn't believe in this. I didn't think it was right. I didn't think we should be doing it, but you proved me wrong. And I just realized that reminded me of something that I did an education program for physicians a few years ago in the greater Washington area. And one physician was similar in that he was resistant to what I was talking about, resistant to healthcare civil rights, for example, and tolerance. We had a discussion about this in a different way, and I suggested ways that he could look at the main topic of conversation. He came up to me at the end of the presentation. He shook my hand. He said, when I came in here, I wasn't interested in what you were talking about. But now I perceive. Now, I'm not suggesting that he became a full-blown progressive equal rights champion, but at least he could rationalize and understand, you know what? I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't be excluding people because of how they look. Now, admittedly, Michael, and I know we can relate to this, using the law as kind of a cudgel to convince people that this might be something they want to do can be very helpful. It was with this gentleman,
Yeah.
but he didn't expect this to happen. So I think these epiphanies, if you will, these learnings that people have and the experiences of others can be transformational, just as what happened in that I wrote about in the South turned out to be transformational.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. If someone raised their, raised the hand to shake my hand, I think my first thought was, who's dragging me? Is he dragging me into a car? So that's
Yeah, exactly.
absolutely. It's yeah. And I believe that was an away game.
Yeah,
it wasn't even his home team. It was an away game, I believe.
No, that's right. And I think that this was also a league where I think there was some preseason resistance
Mm-hmm.
to integration. There was a lot of that in some parts of the country. I think this was one of the places where such resistance was a highlight of early spring.
Yeah. It's amazing looking back that the resistance sometimes was so strong that owners would actually just go bankrupt or lose the team instead of taking the steps to integrate. That's pretty telling. I mean, many did, but still, as you said, some didn't, especially the league, I believe, centered in Louisiana. That was something.
Oh, there were some. There were two places that virtually all the players I talked to, I would always ask them what was the best place you played and the worst place.
Right.
There were two worst places that virtually everyone said, Shreveport, Louisiana, and Hagerstown, Maryland. That they got very emotional in talking about what it was like to play. And I asked them, why do you think it was so much more difficult? Why were people so much viler in the stands in these places? They didn't really have an explanation, but for some of them, their entire facial expression changed when they started talking about playing in these locations. And I've been to both many, many times. I certainly don't have any revelation about why in the 1950s they were like this. But it is really interesting to see what these men still remember really potently.
Yeah.
This was one of the things that was at the top of the list.
Yeah. And I remember a couple of places they noted which were, I won't say their favorites, but they thought they least resistance. One I believe might have been Corpus Christi. Christmas might have been one, and I can't remember another one. But what I thought of when I read these, and you'd also mentioned, of course, larger cities tended to move a little better. But I think the places that you mentioned, there might have also been a military presence nearby, like Corpus Christi and maybe Jacksonville, I think you might have mentioned. But as I'm thinking that with the integration, with Eisenhower finally signing integration of the armed services back in maybe 48, I think you mentioned, that I wonder if that also might have had a good effect or an effect towards easing the community into integration.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that clearly in larger cities, for the most part, they tended to be more tolerant than smaller towns.
Yeah.
I also found that large port cities like Mobile, Alabama, tended to be more accepting than smaller cities or even mid-sized cities. Now, of course, all of it is relative, but still, I think if you look at places in the Piedmont area of Virginia, in the Norfolk, Virginia, Newport News area, tended to be Portsmouth more tolerant than Hagerstown, for example. Hagerstown was in the same league as these Virginia cities. So yes, there were outside influences, whether it's large city, port, perhaps military base, depending on where it was. So yes, that definitely could play a big role.
Great. I want to, I'm looking at the time, so I don't know when, at what point we're going to be interrupted here, but there's one other thing I want to ask you about that I know we discussed it earlier and you touched on a little bit, talking about the then and now. And now, I mean, this year we've experienced one thing that very few could have predicted, being the COVID-19 pandemic, which has just changed everyone's life in a way that, it's tough to fathom, but we're getting used to. And the other one would be the social, the protest, and dealing with the police brutality, and the murder of George Floyd, and of course, after that, the protests that were, or that have been, very multicultural. What do you think that these players or men that you spoke to that went through the integration in the 50s, what do you think they would feel about the then and now especially looking at the now?
I think one of the aspects of what we're experiencing today that would be most gratifying, in a sense, is that many of the protests, many of the reactions are multiracial. I think they would take a lot of satisfaction from that many of the communities that they played in, there was some level of multiracial response, we'll put it that way. Some positive, some negative.
Right.
But when it was positive, it was tremendously powerful to them. And that kind of echoed for them what they were doing beyond learning how to play professional baseball. And I think that they would look at where we are today with a mixture of sadness and hope, in a sense, just as they were where they were in 1952, and we were with Jim Crow and segregation and all the things that they lived with and that we have learned about. They would look at this again as the John Lewis continuum, that there were things that needed to be done then. There were things that needed to change. There are frankly always things that need to change. And now we're at a different point in time where there are things that need to change. Without comparing eras and looking at one challenge against another, I think that they saw themselves at the end of the day as playing a historic role. It's not something they would brag about,
right?
Not something they'd like to talk about, not something they would tell their wives and kids about, but they knew. And they knew over time what they did. So I think they would look at this as, okay, this is the next challenge. This is where we are today. And with a different type of multiracial response, maybe they would think there's a greater chance of getting where we need to go sooner than what happened in the 1950s.
Yep. Very good. And I find it interesting that actually, even today, some of the most noteworthy comments still come from the sports side. For example, the whole interaction between Drew Brees and President Trump. What's happening in NASCAR. I mean, it's so fascinating that still sports, in a way, in a sense, leads the way.
Well, that's a great point too. I think, as we know and as we've experienced, sports is under a spotlight, and sports is a highlight.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are clear differences today with our social media world, instant communication, the internet, and the popularity of different sports in ways that didn't exist in the 50s. But you're right, that also goes to that larger point you made earlier. In all of these communities, people knew what the athletes were doing. People knew what the stars were doing. People knew what the heroes were doing. They were very conscious of that. So that you can imagine,
right,
if the time had been different, if there were no Jim Crow segregation, imagine, excuse me, what a Chuck Harmon, if he spoke about the Brown versus Board of Education decision or something of historical moment at the time, imagine how he would have been listened to if he had had the opportunity and the microphone that athletes have today, because they certainly were very conscious of the role they played in the community and their actions and their words. So absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think I was able to finally bring up some of the question pages. I'm gonna run through those.
I'm glad, Michael,
else.
you're responsible for that, not me.
I take full, I accept full blame for that. I take responsibility for that. This is an interesting question, and hopefully it's a long one. In Jane Levy's relatively recent Babe Ruth book, she talked about the Babe's extensive postseason exhibition games with the Negro League teams. Did he do any of that with the minor leagues teams in the South? The question mentioned minor league Negro leagues, but I actually think there are no minor league Negro leagues, so it's just really just minor league teams. Did you call or know anything about the? I mean, some players did. We know about the Dodgers went on trips. Did you know about I guess the Yankees or other teams doing the same?
Well, the Yankees at the time were. Remember that the Yankees were not in the first wave of big league teams that integrated, and that includes in their minor league system too. So that while Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig barnstormed throughout the country, including in areas of the South, they barnstormed in many of these places, as you said earlier, Michael, to make money. You know, many of these players didn't earn a lot in the big leagues, certainly in the 20s and 30s. And there were exceptions like Ruth, who were national icon type stars and made salaries commensurate with that. But many other players did this to supplement their income. Many players did when they played with people like Satchel Paige, for example, Josh Gibson, and they realized the immense talent that these men had. But these players didn't then go back and lobby the Yankees or the Brooklyn Dodgers or the Boston Braves. Let's integrate. They didn't. That did not happen.
Right.
So the barnstorming was off season and in spring training as the teams barnstormed up north. Sometimes they'd play in 3, 4, 5 cities as they traveled up north. These were big money makers for the teams. Then after the season, the players got to keep for themselves.
Right.
If they barnstormed outside of the team setting, the money that they earned. But I think what's one of the significant tragedies, there are many white players in the 20s and 30s who said that they played with the greatest players they had ever seen, who were currently in the Negro Leagues. But it always left me thinking, okay, but you really didn't do anything about that. So I think it's very interesting as a baseball fan that this happened, as a historian, as an author. But it took, of course, Jackie Robinson, but then it took 4 more years till 1951 for any Southern team to consider integrating. And part of the reason, I think, is what you had said earlier, air conditioning. People started having air conditioning and TVs. Why should we go outside? It's hot outside. Let's just stay home with our little tiny TV and sit in the air conditioning. A lot of teams couldn't compete against that. So what would they do? Let's bring in Percy Miller, the local Jackie Robinson. And for many of them, if not most of them, that provided a significant economic benefit.
Right, and by significant, you touched on this in the book. At least from the Negro attendance, the attendance may go from maybe 8 or 10 people per game to thousands or over 1,000, well over 1,000. Basically, filling out so that In a couple of cases, they almost had to integrate a couple of the stands just so people could sit.
That's right. I think that one of the best stories about that, Dave Hoskins integrated the Texas League in, I think, 1952.
Mm-hmm.
I did some figuring and adding up attendance figures in games where he pitched. The number of people who just came to watch him pitch actually exceeded the total attendance of most teams in the league.
Wow.
So if you just look at Dave Hoskins, let's say pitching 20 games a year, the number of people who came to watch him play in those 20 games exceeded the entire attendance for the year of, if not most of the teams in the league, a plurality. So that's one of the best examples of, wow, we're drawing people in that we've never drawn before. And then from the owner's perspective, and we're making a lot of money.
Right. And actually with Haskins, I think it was also big that here we have a pitcher. We don't have like a second baseman or an outfielder. We have someone holding the ball for half the game, who controls the game more than any. I mean, the pitcher controls the game. And yet now it's not. Now we have a black pitcher up there who is striking out batters, who maybe even be hitting a couple batters. So there's a lot. I mean, that to me is even a greater step than, for example, a Hank Aaron playing second base and then going up and hitting on a home run. So
I think that's a great point, and that may even be part of the reason there were death threats against him.
Yeah.
When he pitched, and Dave eventually did get to the big leagues. He pitched with the Cleveland Indians.
Mm-hmm.
So he spoke about that at the time, about these death threats. But then, as he was quoted, I think he said something like, yes, there were threats. I was aware of it, but I'm a ball player. I'm going to go out and pitch.
Yep.
Player after player would tell me that with all the insults that they were subjected to, both living conditions, the reality of Jim Crow, the verbal insults, that they would say, we took it out on the ball.
Yeah.
We didn't take it out on other folks. We took it out on the ball. And that happened time after time. Many of these men thought that what they lived through, what they looked at as a significant motivator.
Yeah. And
for many, it worked because it allowed them to progress up the ladder in professional baseball.
Well, that's a time-honored motivation. As a Little League baseball coach, sometimes a kid will get hit or get his feelings hurt, and I say, well, just take it out on the ball. So it's funny. Here's a great question that your book discusses that I know we haven't, which is a phenomenal question. What was the relationship between black and white players like? And was there much off the field interaction? Great questions.
Well, let's look at the first part. That in many teams, the interpersonal interactions were pretty good. That players were accepted as teammates. They tended to get along. They supported each other. Now, of course, that wasn't true for all teams and all players.
Right.
But as far as interacting off the field, there was none. Zero, because of Jim Crow in the South. The only interaction would be when they were going from town to town, riding on the same bus. But remember, they didn't eat in the same place. They didn't stay in the same place. And for some players, they were told to wait outside and the restaurant would bring them food, or they were told, we don't serve people like you at all. And their teammates would bring them food either on the team bus or outside. So the interactions were very limited, that was also a real source of significant frustration and consternation for many of the players, that they had a hard time with that. They were on an island unto themselves in a very dangerous sea, if you will.
Yeah.
And the support that they received, limited or not, was only at the ballpark, or maybe, as I said, when teammates would bring them food on the bus. So for many of them, those hours that they would spend away from the park, those are the most difficult hours of their lives, and certainly of their seasons, because what am I supposed to do?
Right.
So, they really felt that.
Sure. Yeah, I think I recall reading your book. Some of the players some of the white players just say, basically, as long as they can help the team, it's fine. And that seemed to be kind of the general thought there. And yeah, you talked a lot about the frustration that the players have to go through. That a lot of them mentioned that, you know, there's no relationship outside of basically the bus and the dugout. So it's, you know, how do you get to know someone? How do you, you know, it is definitely difficult. Another question here. Which interviewee affected you the most?
I would say Chuck Harmon. Chuck Harmon, because I became very close to him. Chuck passed away a couple of years ago. I became very close to his family, his granddaughter, and his wife. And he and I did a lot of events together. After the book was published for several years, we stayed in touch, talked fairly regularly. And I think the reason that he made an impact, it's such an impact, it's less so perhaps about something he told me than something his granddaughter told me. His granddaughter came up to me at one of the events that we were doing, and she said, I want to thank you for writing about my dad. He doesn't like to talk about himself, and I had no idea that he did what you wrote. So he's getting renewed attention, renewed applause, renewed, I don't want to say pats on the back, but renewed thank you for what you did, that it means the world to him. And she said, it remains the world to me.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I think we lost Bruce for a moment.
I think we lost Bruce too. My
That's
goodness.
okay.
Well, it is almost 4:15, and that might be.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get through these questions that I see now. There are a couple of them here that I may be able to touch on quickly. One of them asks, "Did the teams have a green book?" And the word green book was never. I didn't see the word green book in the book. However, the teams definitely had places set aside that their players would stay on, whether they were home or whether they went to other cities. So they did have, in a sense, a green book or a black-owned hotel. I mean, the teams knew where to take these other players. So I think in that sense, they did have what would be considered the same as a green book. And I'm sorry, Jamie, I did cut you off there.
Oh, that's quite all right. I'd rather you answer the questions, but I don't want to take up too much more time. I know people have to get going, but you've done a great job. And again, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry we kept you a little late, but it was worth it, I think. And I will send everyone a recording of this session. So thank you, Michael. You were an amazing moderator, and I will talk to Bruce and thank him as well. And I will follow up with an email. So thank you all. We appreciate your time. Stay safe, stay well, and look for a follow-up email. Thank you.
Thank you.